Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of With the Old Breed by E.B. Sledge, narrated by George Wilson. This work is copyrighted 1981 by Presidio Press. This recording is copyrighted 2001 by Recorded Books. Paul Fussell writes the following introduction. I owe a large debt to John Keegan, the British military historian, for it was he who first told me about this book. It was in the mid-1980s, and I was searching out testimonies from Second World War combatants for my book Wartime. "Have you read Sledge?" Keegan asked. I'd not heard of Sledge. His book had appeared a few years before, with little fanfare and minimal critical notice. But Keegan, a sharp-eyed and comprehensive researcher, had found the book and was so impressed as to write later, in his book The Second World War, "Among the thousands of soldiers' stories, I am haunted by one from the Pacific War." Keegan found Sledge's account of his experience fighting in the South Pacific to be one of the most arresting documents in war literature. Keegan's haunted is the right word. Readers of this book will find it hard to forget, and they will not easily brush away its troubling revelations about what the modern world periodically requires its boys to do and to suffer. One cause of this book's distinction is that its author is not an author. Sledge wrote this memoir less for strangers than to tell his own family what his war had been like. It was his wife who persuaded him to submit it to a publisher. The book is devoid of the literary expediencies and suavities that may occasion skepticism or disgust in more artistically self-conscious war memoirs. Sledge is so little an author in the pejorative sense that his eye seems never to wander from his subject to contemplate the literary effect he's creating. His style is like window glass. You don't pause to notice it. You look through it to the actuality it discloses. It is this honesty, simplicity, and modesty that give Sledge's book its extraordinary power. Eugene Bondurant Sledge, Sledgehammer to his later Marine Corps buddies and friends, was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1923. As a child, he was sickly, afflicted first with malaria and then with rheumatic fever, which weakened his heart and confined him to a wheelchair for nearly a year, during which he had to miss school. But he recovered to enter high school in 1938, where he did better in science and history than in algebra. Latin grammar bored him, but he found translating Caesar on warfare exciting. He liked classes in literature, except when the teacher left the world of solid data and began talking about symbolism and the like. He learned to play the snare drum and joined both the marching band and the school orchestra, and he was attracted more to informal than to organized sports. He especially liked sandlot baseball. Discipline at home and at school was strict, he remembers, so I stayed out of trouble. His family lived on the edge of town, and his father, a physician, taught him to shoot and to observe things precisely and then to describe all I had seen. Sledge read a great deal and learned to revere Washington, Audubon, Daniel Boone, and, of course, Robert E. Lee. His grandfathers on both sides had been Confederate officers. On his father's phonograph, Sledge played Bach, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. He liked pretty girls a lot, but during adolescence he seemed to like riding, hunting, and fishing even more. He was a freshman at a 2-year military college in Alabama when, a year after Pearl Harbor, he decided to enter the Marines, enlisting in a program that guaranteed him a further year of school before he joined. He underwent the dire passage from innocence to experience that he describes here from 1943 to 1946. When the war was over, he found himself miraculously unwounded, at least in body. He studied business administration at Auburn University without much sense of vocation, and then worked briefly in real estate and insurance before perceiving that his interest in biology and zoology was pointing him toward a quite different career. He returned to Auburn for a master's degree and then went to the University of Florida for a Ph.D. in zoology. Now a professor of biology, specializing in ornithology at the University of Montevallo, Alabama, Sledge lives quietly near the university, which is not far from Birmingham. On the wall of his living room, reports Studs Terkel, who interviewed Sledge for his book The Good War, there is a plaque, the gift of Sledge's buddies, honoring one extraordinary Marine and concluding, "God love you, Sledgehammer," a sentiment readers of this book may want to echo. Sledge still signs his letters Semper Fidelis. Of course it was the Marines that attracted this high-spirited, patriotic boy, unable to resist the dress blue trousers, khaki shirt, necktie, and white barracks hat of the recruiting sergeant. But it wasn't long before he became acquainted with the less attractive side of life in the Marines, the ritual humiliations and abuse incident to indoctrination and infantry training. Sledge rapidly toughened physically and mentally, learned to call the ground the deck and a wall a bulkhead, and came to understand that if he didn't kill the Jap would most certainly kill him. As one instructor urged, "Kick him in the balls before he kicks you in yours." He developed new self-confidence as he mastered the use of infantry weapons, with special emphasis on the Marines' favorite, the K-bar knife. While Sledge and his fellow Marines grew tougher, however, they remained innocent, protected by their naive optimism from noticing that the destiny they were preparing for was to be destroyed or maimed. The fact that our lives might end violently or that we might be crippled while we were still boys didn't seem to register. Next, the crowded, smelly troop transport and the questions tugging at Sledge's mind. Would I do my duty or be a coward? Maybe I'd disgrace my outfit by running away. Then came more last-minute training, now on the island of New Caledonia, with ominous emphasis on bayonet and hand-to-hand techniques. Sledge and his buddies were shunted into the 5th Regiment of the 1st Marine Division, replacing people killed and wounded on Guadalcanal and at Cape Gloucester, leaving Sledge proud to be a member of this distinguished unit, which fought at Belleau Wood in the First World War and was later to fight in Korea and Vietnam. When Sledge joined, it was recuperating and training on the miserable island of Pavuvu, north of Guadalcanal. Sledge was assigned to the 60-millimeter mortar section of Company K, commanded by Captain Andrew A. Akak Haldane, remembered by Sledge as the finest and most popular officer I ever knew. On Pavuvu, rumors from the Guadalcanal campaign were numerous, and accounts of Japanese sadism and brutality fueled an attitude of murderous hatred for that enemy, hatred fully reciprocated, the Marines knew, by the Japanese. This mutual hatred, says Sledge, resulted in savage, ferocious fighting with no holds barred. This was not the dispassionate killing seen on other fronts or in other wars. This was a brutish, primitive hatred as characteristic of the horror of war in the Pacific as the palm trees and the islands. Once, after hearing blood-curdling screams close by at night, Sledge found the next morning that a Japanese soldier had jumped into a Marine foxhole where the Marine had jammed his stiff forefinger deep into the Japanese soldier's eye socket, killing him in agony. Such, says Sledge, was the physical horror and brutish reality of war for us. Both sides declined to take prisoners, and both sides defiled enemy corpses. Japanese skulls, thoroughly cleansed, became so popular as Marine and Army trophies that collecting them was finally officially forbidden. The next assignment for the 1st Marine Division was the reduction of the Japanese-held island of Peleliu, one of the Palau Island group some 500 miles east of the Philippines. Many now believe that the invasion of this 6-square-mile island was entirely unnecessary. Irrelevant to the winning of the Pacific War, some believed it at the time, holding that the island could be bypassed safely without its posing any threat to the imminent invasion of the Philippines. Just to be sure, however, Admiral Nimitz decided to neutralize the threat. Sledge and his buddies did so at a cost of 1,262 dead and 5,274 wounded Marines and 10,000 dead Japanese. The fighting on Peleliu was supposed to last 3 or 4 days. It lasted for almost 2 months, from mid-September to November 1944, and it was one of the worst slaughters of Marines in the Pacific, if one of the less well-publicized. Tarawa became better known because it was virtually the first terrible island invasion, and Iwo Jima became famous in part because of Joe Rosenthal's photography. However, the conditions for fighting on Peleliu were about as bad as they could be. The weather was hot and humid, with frequent rain and temperatures rising to 115 degrees. On the 4th day, wrote Robert Martin, a Time magazine correspondent with the Marines, there were as many casualties from heat prostration as from wounds. The island was of coral, with solid coral ridges and mesas in which the Japanese had been excavating caves and passageways for years. They used these for command posts and troop assembly chambers, and they positioned mortars and artillery pieces and machine guns at the entrances, which were often protected by movable steel doors. Although the Marines hopefully carried entrenching shovels, they found it virtually impossible to dig in through the coral, and thus they had to lie largely on the surface under deadly accurate mortar and artillery fire. To hit the jagged coral deck meant cutting and abrading yourself each time, and Marine uniforms and shoes were torn to bits. Because digging the usual toilet cat holes was impossible, excrement was everywhere before the island was secured, its stench blending with the smells of the dead, with the whole hellish scene baked in the hot sun. As Martin reported, Peleliu is a terrible place. Few combat veterans have remembered as well as Sledge the effects of fear, and Sledge knows that the fear is not just of being killed or wounded. It is fear of something even worse, fear of not being able to take it, and exhibiting the symptoms of cowardice to an audience of men who have trusted you. Sledge tells how, when his landing craft approaches the beach, the naval gunfire deafening everyone, his fear is of something seldom mentioned in more heroic and bellicose military narratives. I felt that my bladder would surely empty itself and reveal me to be the coward I was. But once ashore under heavy fire, Sledge forgets himself in his pity for the others. As he looks around and sees Marines being slaughtered, his word for it, he feels simply sick. As he writes, I had tasted the bitterest essence of war, the sight of helpless comrades being slaughtered, and it filled me with disgust. Disgusting as well is his first sight of a Japanese corpse, its viscera displayed and glistening, bespecked with fine coral dust. And when he sees a medical corpsman bending over a boy Marine who just died, he invokes a word that will resonate throughout this book. The word is waste. A blood-soaked battle dressing was on the side of the dead man's neck. His fine, handsome, boyish face was ashen. What a pitiful waste, I thought. He can't be a day over 17 years old. I thanked God his mother couldn't see him. The corpsman held the dead Marine's chin tenderly between the thumb and fingers of his left hand, and made the sign of the cross with his right hand. Tears streamed down his dusty, tanned, grief-contorted face while he sobbed quietly. Prayer is Sledge's frequent solace. The Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm his favorites. It is, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, that he recites as his battalion attacks en masse, running across the bare airfield, and he sees Marines everywhere going down, blown up and torn apart by artillery or mangled by machine-gun bullets. Sledge can't imagine how he survived this massacre. And he concludes that this murderous dash across several hundred yards under massed fire was was his very worst combat experience. Not long after, in a moment of silence during a quiet conversation, he hears, as he says, a loud voice say clearly and distinctly, "You will survive the war." No one in the group has spoken. The voice has been heard by Sledge alone. Perhaps he has come momentarily unhinged, or perhaps the intensity of the unspoken wish to come out alive has skewed his hearing and his understanding. Normally skeptical of visions and ghost stories and the like, Sledge is persuaded that God spoke to him that night. As a result, he says, he resolved, like other infantrymen who have barely escaped death, to make his life amount to something after the war. Astonished and appalled by the unbelievable carnage, Sledge felt he had to make a record of it. Diaries were forbidden, but in a little rubber bag he took from a Japanese body, Sledge carried his small New Testament, and into its pages he slipped tiny sheets of paper covered with notes. His frequent recourse to his testament misled his buddies into imagining him more pious than he was. He was actually, as he says, keeping notes. After some patrolling and night defensive work, during which one K Company Marine goes noisily mad and becomes quiet only when hit with a shovel, in the morning he turns out to be dead, Sledge's battalion encounters the Army infantrymen of the veteran 81st Division sent to reinforce the Peleliu operation. The popular and amusing animosities between Army and Marines are suddenly laid aside. Things are now too serious for the normal Marine sport of barking at the dog faces, and as a result of common experience, says Sledge, we respected each other completely. Something in me died at Peleliu, Sledge writes. One of the many casualties there is his initial innocence about human evil. Without turning mechanically pessimistic or cynical, Sledge is obliged to complicate and deepen his understanding of human possibility when he watches a fellow Marine use his K-bar knife to extract gold teeth from a wounded but still living Japanese who kicks and writhes as the Marine goes to work. Frustrated and impatient, the Marine finally eases his task by slicing his prisoner's cheeks ear to ear, which, if it makes him gurgle in his own blood and thrash about, exposes the teeth nicely. Watching this, Sledge learns what every generation would learn if it could see its youth engaged in infantry fighting. As a Marine sergeant told Philip Caputo during the Vietnam War, "Before you leave here, sir, you're going to learn that one of the most brutal things in the world is your average 19-year-old American boy." Of nasty, sadistic episodes like this, Sledge writes, "Such was the incredible cruelty that decent men could commit when reduced to a brutish existence in their fight for survival amid the violent death, terror, tension, fatigue, and filth that was the infantryman's war." He goes on to emphasize that such an understanding of human behavior, obvious to all on the line, was not readily available to those removed only a short distance to the rear. If you are back only a couple of 100 yards behind anger and cruelty and hysteria and fear of death, you are too far back to understand, and that is one of the reasons Sledge has written this book. It is about the mystique, that is the right word, of killing to avoid being killed, torturing to avoid being tortured. At various headquarters, reason may govern, but the line is a place of passion and madness. Sledge uses the words totally incomprehensible, absolute as they are, responsibly when, observing that Peleliu made savages of us all, he declares, "We existed in an environment totally incomprehensible to men behind the lines, service troops and civilians." Sledge and his buddies can hardly believe it when, ragged, filthy, and hollow-eyed, they are finally relieved by Army infantry, which required 6 more weeks to end the battle. Sledge's Company K, formerly 235 strong, climbs aboard the departing transport with only 85 survivors, including 2 of the original 7 officers. Back on Pavuvu, there is the shock of re-encountering people innocent of murder and cruelty and fear. A nice Red Cross girl who proffers paper cups of grapefruit juice to men coming off the ship. A new, unbloodied second lieutenant whose uniform is too neat and clean and who offends Sledge by calling him Sonny. Back under tents, Company K receives replacements, and before long training resumes, and rumors begin to imply that there is going to be another rugged campaign soon. News about the carnage then in progress on Iwo Jima suggested that the Japanese were resisting more insanely the nearer the war came to their main islands. Okinawa was very near. As a defensive position, Okinawa was a Peleliu 10 times larger. The island was 60 miles long and 18 miles wide at its widest point. It was defended by 110,000 Japanese who had excavated and fortified elaborate caves, tunnels, and casemates concealing a deadly accumulation of artillery. This time, Sledge's battalion was in reserve at first, but it still had to land on the beach on D-Day, April 1st, 1945. Climbing down the landing net, Sledge was still frightened, although, having been through Peleliu, not as frightened as before. But this time there proved little reason for fright. The landing was virtually unopposed, and the soldiers and Marines, a force ultimately numbering 500,000, waded ashore smiling and even singing. To Sledge it was the most pleasant surprise of the war. The weather the first few days was cool and dry, too, and the deck was not of coral but of eminently diggable dirt. The smell so far was mainly of pine trees. The battle plan was first to attack across the island, cutting it in two, and then for the Marines to attack to the north and the army to the south. Cutting the island in half took only 4 days. Resistance was light and scattered. The seizing of the northern part of the island was not too bad either. The 6th Marine Division did it in 7 days. In the south, however, the army met fantastic resistance, and soon the Marines were called to assist. The 1st Marine Division relieved the badly chewed-up 27th Infantry Division, and Sledge was headed for action again, filled with dread. This time he was on the line, or mortally near it, for 50 days, beginning May 1st with a failed Marine attack on one of the numerous southern ridges in rain and mud against terrible fire. The news arriving May 8th that Germany had surrendered did little to raise Marine Corps spirits, for everyone knew that the Japanese on Okinawa would resist until all were killed, and that, as Sledge says, Japan would have to be invaded with the same gruesome prospects. But only a fatuously optimistic Marine could believe he would survive long enough for that horror. Today, almost 50 years later, Sledge still has nightmares about the bloody, muddy month of May on Okinawa, when the artillery fire from both sides was so heavy and unremitting that he had a constant headache. The Japanese were lodged so deeply in their caves that the American artillery hardly bothered them, and when it paused, they resumed their defense with rifles, grenades, mortars, and machine guns, firing at corpsmen and litter-bearers in purposeful contempt for Western civilities. The battlefield was soon scarred, cratered, and treeless, a mess of mud and water-filled holes and slippery ridges, looking like Verdun in the Great War. A week-long stay in a muddy hole on Half Moon Ridge near Shuri, the main Japanese point of resistance, almost drove Sledge insane. There he existed in an atmosphere of unburied, stinking Japanese and Marine corpses, maggots, flies, rain, dysentery, knee-deep mud, and the constant fear of death at any moment. It was the most ghastly corner of hell I had ever witnessed, Sledge writes. Peleliu had been bad, but this was an environment so degrading I believed we had been flung into hell's own cesspool. To slip in the mud and fall was to have one's clothing filled with wriggling maggots from the rotting corpses, and if a Marine slipped and slid down the back slope of the muddy ridge, he was apt to reach the bottom vomiting. The war for Sledge and the others fighting in conditions like this was insanity, and some Marines went insane, reduced by the shelling to crying or mad shouting and screaming. Others were removed from the line suffering from malaria or pneumonia. Those with trench foot stayed put. The Japanese, finally driven out of their Shuri positions, withdrew further south to a last-stand defense at Kunishi Ridge, where, as usual, they occupied deep caves, largely resistant to artillery, aerial bombing, and naval gunfire. Despite hopes for some respite, Sledge's company had to continue with its dreadful work, and, sensing that his luck was running out, one can't expect to beat the terrible odds forever, Sledge was in a near panic. But he did not break. When his battalion finally reached the southern shore of the island, Company K was down to 50 men. The reduction of Okinawa had taken 82 days. PFC Eugene Sledge had lost 25 pounds, and on his hands and arms were open sores that would not heal for months. But a final indignity. His battalion had to now move north again, burying the blackened Japanese corpses and salvaging brass shell cases. American casualties on Okinawa came to almost 40,000. There were also more than 26,000 neuropsychiatric cases, men evacuated after psychological breakdowns. In addition to the destruction of the Japanese defenders, some 42,000 Okinawan civilians were killed. Knowing all too well what the forthcoming invasion of Japan would mean for them, Sledge and the lucky survivors in his outfit heard the news of the A-bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with an indescribable sense of relief. They would live, even if shaken and illuminated, for a lifetime about the depth of human iniquity. Sledge's testimony about these almost incredible events is entirely credible because of his evident decency and his remoteness from any sort of disingenuousness, actual or literary. His way with both life and language is straight, without irony, hyperbole, or the desire to show off. If another writer asserted that in the shower he had seen a long-time member of the old breed, Gunnery Sergeant St. Elmo M. Haney, briskly scrubbing his genital organs with a GI brush, we might disbelieve. When Sledge tells us this, we know it is true. Veterans of front lines everywhere will applaud the accuracy with which Sledge registers the sights and sounds of combat. Authors and screenwriters are likely to assert that bullets whine. Sledge knows that they snap. It is artillery shells that whine while mortar shells whisper faintly. Also remarkably accurate is Sledge's memory of physical details. He recalls exactly what it's like to hike with a heavy pack in a long column that frequently and inexplicably stops. If a man put down his load, he was sure to hear, "Pick up your gear, we're moving out." When the column paused, each man was faced with what Sledge calls, without irony, a big decision. The big decision in every man's mind at each pause in the column's forward progress was whether to drop his load and hope for a lengthy pause, or to stand there and support all the weight rather than putting it down and having to pick it up again right away. Sledge's precise description and honest narration accommodate without apology or ex post facto self-consciousness his boyish pride in being a Marine and helping to win the war, as well as his natural disdain for those in the rear so unimaginative as not to be able to understand what the line troops go through. He honestly hero-worships his company's skipper, Captain Haldane, and he honestly reports his sobs when he hears that Haldane has been killed, and he still mourns him after all these years. His sharp eye for evidence of nobility and courage in others prompts him to celebrate the selfless dedication of the corpsmen. Sledge's sense of honor obliges him to keep his promises, even apparently trivial ones. His book indicates the way he has been true to his wartime experience. He has not allowed the passage of time or subsequent political history to soften the cruel outlines of an experience he must not euphemize or forget. After 15 days of fighting on Peleliu, Sledge was finally overcome by the strain. I felt myself choking up. I slowly turned my back to the men facing me as I sat on my helmet and put my face in my hands to try to shut out reality. I began sobbing. My body shuddered and shook. But what occasioned this outburst is less Sledge's own fear than his pity for others. He has just heard of a severely wounded Marine nearby whose body, lifted onto a litter, came apart. I was sickened and revolted to see healthy young men get hurt and killed day after day. I felt I couldn't take any more. It is this extraordinary compassion that makes Sledge so unique a memoirist of war. One expects an infantryman or Marine to feel fear and pity for himself, but it is rare for a soldier to be distraught because he feels for others, total strangers often, and to be distraught without a trace of sentimental affectation or secret self-congratulation. For this reason, Sledge doubtless suffered more than many of his fellow Marines, and he has not notably hardened since. "I don't like to watch television shows with violence in them," he says today. A poem he likes to quote comes from the First World War, but he knows it will serve for the Second and subsequent wars as well. It is Wilfred Owen's Insensibility, Owen's ironic celebration of men devoid of compassion and imagination, whose experiences in war are easier and more forgettable than those of their sensitive comrades. Happy are men who yet before they are killed can let their veins run cold, whom no compassion fleers, or makes their feet sore on the alleys cobbled with their brothers. Happy are those who lose imagination. They have enough to carry with ammunition. Happy the soldier home with not a notion how somewhere every dawn some men attack. But cursed are dullards whom no cannon stuns. By choice they made themselves immune to pity. If it was Sledge's fine sensibility that caused him to suffer more than some, it is that same sensibility that in this book has kept the distinctions firm, the compassion warm, the imagination agile, and the values admirable. Paul Fussell. And now, With the Old Breed.
Preface. This book is an account of my World War II experiences in training and in combat with Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division during the Peleliu and Okinawa campaigns. It is not a history, and it is not my story alone. I have attempted, rather, to be the spokesman for my comrades, who were swept with me into the abyss of war. I hope they will approve my efforts. I began writing this account immediately after Peleliu, while we were in rest camp on Puvuvu Island. I outlined the entire story with detailed notes as soon as I returned to civilian life, and I have written down certain episodes during the years since then. Mentally, I have gone over and over the details of these events, but I haven't been able to draw them all together and write them down until now. I have done extensive research with published and unpublished histories and documents pertaining to my division's role in the Peleliu and Okinawa campaigns. I have been amazed at the vast difference in the perception of events recounted in these narratives, as contrasted to my experience on the front line. My Pacific War experiences have haunted me, and it has been a burden to retain this story. But time heals, and the nightmares no longer wake me in a cold sweat, with pounding heart and racing pulse. Now I can write this story, painful though it is to do so. In writing it, I'm fulfilling an obligation I have long felt to my comrades in the 1st Marine Division, all of whom suffered so much for our country. None came out unscathed. Many gave their lives, many their health, and some their sanity. All who survived will long remember the horror they would rather forget. But they suffered, and they did their duty, so a sheltered homeland can enjoy the peace that was purchased at such a high cost. We owe those Marines a profound debt of gratitude. Chapter 1. Making of a Marine. I enlisted in the Marine Corps on 3 December 1942 at Marion, Alabama. At the time, I was a freshman at Marion Military Institute. My parents and brother Edward had urged me to stay in college as long as possible in order to qualify for a commission in some technical branch of the U.S. Army. But prompted by a deep feeling of uneasiness that the war might end before I could get overseas into combat, I wanted to enlist in the Marine Corps as soon as possible. Ed, a Citadel graduate and a second lieutenant in the Army, suggested life would be more beautiful for me as an officer. Mother and father were mildly distraught at the thought of me in the Marines as an enlisted man. That is, cannon fodder. So when a Marine recruiting team came to Marion Institute, I compromised and signed up for one of the Corps' new officer training programs. It was called V12. The recruiting sergeant wore dress blue trousers, a khaki shirt, necktie, and white barracks hat. His shoes had a shine the likes of which I'd never seen. He asked me lots of questions and filled out numerous official papers. When he asked, "Any scars, birthmarks, or other unusual features?" I described an inch-long scar on my right knee. I asked, "Why such a question?" He replied, "So they can identify you on some Pacific beach after the Japs blast off your dog tags." This was my introduction to the stark realism that characterized the Marine Corps, I later came to know. The college year ended the last week of May 1943. I had the month of June at home in Mobile before I had to report 1 July for duty at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. I enjoyed the train trip from Mobile to Atlanta because the train had a steam engine. The smoke smelled good, and the whistle added a plaintive note reminiscent of an unhurried life. The porters were impressed and most solicitous when I told them, with no little pride, that I was on my way to becoming a Marine. My official Marine Corps meal ticket got me a large, delicious shrimp salad in the dining car and the admiring glances of the steward in attendance. On my arrival in Atlanta, a taxi deposited me at Georgia Tech, where the 180-man Marine detachment lived in Harrison Dormitory. Recruits were scheduled to attend classes year-round. In my case, about 2 years, graduate, and then go to the Marine base at Quantico, Virginia for officers training. A Marine regular, Captain Donald Payzant, was in charge. He had served with the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. Seeming to glory in his duty and his job as our commander, he loved the Corps and was salty and full of swagger. Looking back, I realize now that he had survived the meat grinder of combat and was simply glad to be in one piece with the good fortune of being stationed at a peaceful college campus. Life at Georgia Tech was easy and comfortable. In short, we didn't know there was a war going on. Most of the college courses were dull and uninspiring. Many of the professors openly resented our presence. It was all but impossible to concentrate on academics. Most of us felt we had joined the Marines to fight, but here we were, college boys again. The situation was more than many of us could stand. At the end of the first semester, 90 of us, half of the detachment, flunked out of school so we could go into the Corps as enlisted men. When the Navy officer in charge of academic affairs called me in to question me about my poor academic performance, I told him I hadn't joined the Marine Corps to sit out the war in college. He was sympathetic to the point of being fatherly, and said he would feel the same way if he were in my place. Captain Payzant gave the 90 of us a pep talk in front of the dormitory the morning we were to board the train for boot camp at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego, California. He told us we were the best men and the best Marines in the detachment. He said he admired our spirit for wanting to get into the war. I think he was sincere. After the pep talk, buses took us to the railway station. We sang and cheered the whole way. We were on our way to war at last. If we had only known what lay ahead of us. Approximately 2.5 years later, I came back through the Atlanta railway station on my way home. Shortly after I stepped off the car for a stroll, a young Army infantryman walked up to me and shook hands. He said he had noticed my 1st Marine Division patch and the campaign ribbons on my chest, and wondered if I had fought at Peleliu. When I said I had, he told me he just wanted to express his undying admiration for men of the 1st Marine Division. He had fought with the 81st Infantry Division, Wildcats, which had come in to help us at Peleliu. Together with the 1st Marine Division, the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division comprised the 3rd Amphibious Corps, commanded by Major General Roy S. Geiger, USMC. For the Palau operation, the 1st Marine Division assaulted Peleliu on 15 September 1944, while the 81st Division took Angar Island and provided a regiment as Corps Reserve. The 81st Division relieved the 1st Marine Division on Peleliu on 20 October and secured the island on 27 November. He was a machine gunner, had been hit by Japanese fire on Bloody Nose Ridge, and was abandoned by his Army comrades. He knew he would either die of his wounds or be cut up by the Japanese when darkness fell. Risking their lives, some Marines had moved in and carried him to safety. The soldier said he was so impressed by the bravery, efficiency, and esprit of the Marines he saw on Peleliu that he swore to thank every veteran of the 1st Marine Division he ever ran across. The Dago people, as those of us bound for San Diego were called, boarded a troop train in a big railroad terminal in Atlanta. Everyone was in high spirits, as though we were headed for a picnic instead of boot camp and a war. The trip across the country took several days and was uneventful but interesting. Most of us had never been west, and we enjoyed the scenery. The monotony of the trip was broken with card games, playing jokes on each other, and waving, yelling, and whistling at any and all women visible. We ate some meals in dining cars on the train, but at certain places the train pulled onto a siding, and we ate in the restaurant in the railroad terminal. Nearly all of the rail traffic we passed was military. We saw long trains composed almost entirely of flat cars, loaded with tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, trucks, and other military equipment. Many troop trains passed us going both ways. Most of them carried Army troops. This rail traffic impressed on us the enormousness of the nation's war effort. We arrived in San Diego early one morning. Collecting our gear, we fell into ranks outside our cars as a first sergeant came along and told the NCOs on our train which buses to get us aboard. This first sergeant looked old to us teenagers. Like ourselves, he was dressed in a green wool Marine uniform, but he had campaign ribbons on his chest. He also wore the green French fourragère on his left shoulder. Later, as a member of the 5th Marine Regiment, I would wear the braided cord around my left arm with pride. But this man sported, in addition, 2 single loops outside his arm. That meant he had served with a regiment, either the 5th or 6th Marines, that had received the award from France for distinguished combat service in World War I. The sergeant made a few brief remarks to us about the tough training we faced. He seemed friendly and compassionate, almost fatherly. His manner threw us into a false sense of well-being. and left us totally unprepared for the shock that awaited us when we got off those buses. "Fall out and board your assigned buses," ordered the first sergeant. "All right, you people, get aboard them buses," the NCOs yelled. They seemed to have become more authoritarian as we approached San Diego. After a ride of only a few miles, the buses rolled to a stop in the big Marine Corps recruit depot, boot camp. As I looked anxiously out the window, I saw many platoons of recruits marching along the streets. Each drill instructor, DI, bellowed his highly individual cadence. The recruits looked as rigid as sardines in a can. I grew nervous at seeing how serious, or rather scared, they seemed. "All right, you people, off them damn buses." We scrambled out, lined up with men from the other buses, and were counted off into groups of about 60. Several trucks rolled by carrying work parties of men still in boot camp or who had finished recently. All looked at us with knowing grins and jeered. "You'll be sorry." This was the standard, unofficial greeting extended to all recruits. Shortly after we debussed, a corporal walked over to my group. He yelled, "Platoon, T-hut, right, haste, forward, hot, double time, hot." He ran us up and down the streets for what seemed hours, and finally to a double line of huts that would house us for a time. We were breathless. He didn't even seem to be breathing hard. "Platoon, hot, right, haste." He put his hands on his hips and looked us over contemptuously. "You people are stupid," he bellowed. From then on, he tried to prove it every moment of every day. "My name is Corporal Doherty. I'm your drill instructor. This is Platoon 984. If any of you idiots think you don't need to follow my orders, just step right out here and I'll beat your ass right now. Your soul may belong to Jesus, but your ass belongs to the Marines. You people are recruits. You're not Marines. You may not have what it takes to be Marines." No one dared move, hardly even to breathe. We were all humbled because there was no doubt the DI meant exactly what he said. Corporal Doherty wasn't a large man by any standard. He stood about 5 feet 10 inches, probably weighed around 160 pounds, and was muscular with a protruding chest and flat stomach. He had thin lips, a ruddy complexion, and was probably as Irish as his name. From his accent, I judged him to be a New Englander, maybe from Boston. His eyes were the coldest, meanest green I ever saw. He glared at us like a wolf whose first and foremost desire was to tear us limb from limb. He gave me the impression that the only reason he didn't do so was that the Marine Corps wanted to use us for cannon fodder to absorb Japanese bullets and shrapnel, so genuine Marines could be spared to capture Japanese positions. That Corporal Doherty was tough and hard as nails, none of us ever doubted. Most Marines recall how loudly their DIs yelled at them, but Doherty didn't yell very loudly. Instead, he shouted in an icy, menacing manner that sent cold chills through us. We believed that if he didn't scare us to death, the Japs couldn't kill us. He was always immaculate, and his uniform fitted him as if the finest tailor had made it for him. His posture was erect, and his bearing reflected military precision. The public pictures a DI wearing sergeant stripes. Doherty commanded our respect and put such fear into us that he couldn't have been more effective if he had had the 6 stripes of a first sergeant instead of the 2 of a corporal. One fact emerged immediately with stark clarity. This man would be the master of our fates in the weeks to come. Doherty rarely drilled us on the main parade ground, but marched or double-timed us to an area near the beach of San Diego Bay. There the deep, soft sand made walking exhausting, just what he wanted. For hours on end, for days on end, we drilled back and forth across the soft sand. My legs ached terribly for the first few days, as did those of everyone else in the platoon. I found that when I concentrated on a fold of the collar or cap of the man in front of me, or tried to count the ships in the bay, my muscles didn't ache as badly. To drop out of ranks because of tired legs was unthinkable. The standard remedy for such shirking was to double time in place to get the legs in shape, before being humiliated and berated in front of the whole platoon by the DI. I preferred the pain to the remedy. Before heading back to the hut area at the end of each drill session, Doherty would halt us, ask a man for his rifle, and tell us he would demonstrate the proper technique for holding the rifle while creeping and crawling. First, though, he would place the butt of the rifle on the sand, release the weapon, and let it drop, saying that anyone who did that would have a miserable day of it. With so many men in the platoon, it was uncanny how often he asked to use my rifle in this demonstration. Then, after demonstrating how to cradle the rifle, he ordered us to creep and crawl. Naturally, the man in front kicked sand onto the rifle of the one behind him. With this and several other techniques, the DI made it necessary for us to clean our rifles several times each day. But we learned quickly, and well, an old Marine Corps truism. The rifle is a Marine's best friend. We always treated it as just that. During the first few days, Doherty once asked one of the recruits a question about his rifle. In answering, the hapless recruit referred to his rifle as "my gun." The DI muttered some instructions to him, and the recruit blushed. He began trotting up and down in front of the huts, holding his rifle in one hand and his penis in the other, chanting, "This is my rifle," as he held up his M1, "and this is my gun," as he moved his other arm. "This is for Japs." He again held aloft his M1. "And this is for fun." He held up his other arm. Needless to say, none of us ever again used the word gun, unless referring to a shotgun, mortar, artillery piece, or naval gun. A typical day in boot camp began with reveille at 0400 hours. We tumbled out of our sacks in the chilly dark and hurried through shaves, dressing, and chow. The grueling day ended with taps at 2200. At any time between taps and reveille, however, the DI might break us out for rifle inspection, close order drill, or for a run around the parade ground or over the sand by the bay. This seemingly cruel and senseless harassment stood me in good stead later when I found that war allowed sleep to no man, particularly the infantryman. Combat guaranteed sleep of the permanent type only. We moved to 2 or 3 different hut areas during the first few weeks, each time on a moment's notice. The order was, "Platoon 984, fall out on the double with rifles, full individual equipment, and sea bags with all gear properly stowed, and prepare to move out in 10 minutes. A mad scramble would follow as men gathered up and packed their equipment. Each man had 1 or 2 close buddies who pitched in to help each other don packs and hoist heavy sea bags onto sagging shoulders. Several men from each hut would stay behind to clean up the huts and surrounding area, as the other men of the platoon struggled under their heavy loads to the new hut area. Upon arrival at the new area, the platoon halted, received hut assignments, fell out, and stowed gear. Just as we got into the huts, we would get orders to fall in for drill with rifles, cartridge belts, and bayonets. The sense of urgency and hurry never abated. Our DI was ingenious in finding ways to harass us. One of the hut areas we were in was across a fence from an aircraft factory where big B-24 Liberator bombers were made. There was an airstrip, too, and the big 4-engine planes came and went low over the tops of the huts. Once one belly landed, going through the fence near our huts. No one was hurt, but several of us ran down to see the crash. When we got back to our area, Corporal Doherty delivered one of his finest orations on the subject of recruits never leaving their assigned area without the permission of their DI. We were all impressed, particularly with the tremendous number of push-ups and other exercises we performed instead of going to noon chow. During close-order drill, the short man had the toughest time staying in step. Every platoon had its feather merchants, short men struggling along with giant strides at the tail end of the formation. At 5 feet 9 inches, I was about 2/3 of the way back from the front guide of Platoon 984. One day, while returning from the bayonet course, I got out of step and couldn't pick up the cadence. Corporal Doherty marched along beside me. In his icy tone, he said, "Boy, if you don't get in step and stay in step, I'm going to kick you so hard in the behind that they're going to have to take both of us to sick bay. It'll take a major operation to get my foot out of your ass." With those inspiring words ringing in my ears, I picked up the cadence and never ever lost it again. The weather became quite chilly, particularly at night. I had to cover up with blankets and overcoat. Many of us slept in dungaree trousers and sweatshirts, in addition to our skivvies. When reveille sounded well before daylight, we only had to pull on our boondockers, field shoes, before falling in for roll call. Each morning after roll call, we ran in the foggy darkness to a large asphalt parade ground for rifle calisthenics. Atop a wooden platform, a muscular physical training instructor led several platoons in a long series of tiring exercises. A public address system played a scratchy recording of 3 o'clock in the morning. We were supposed to keep time with the music. The monotony was broken only by frequent whispered curses and insults directed at our enthusiastic instructor, and by the too frequent appearance of various DIs who stalked the extended ranks, making sure all hands exercised vigorously. Not only did the exercises harden our bodies, but our hearing became super keen from listening for the DIs as we skipped a beat or two for a moment of rest in the inky darkness. At the time, we didn't realize or appreciate the fact that the discipline we were learning in responding to orders under stress often would mean the difference later in combat between success or failure, even living or dying. The ear training also proved to be an unscheduled dividend when Japanese infiltrators slipped around at night. Shortly, we received word that we were going to move out to the rifle range. We greeted the announcement enthusiastically. Rumor had it that we would receive the traditional broad-brimmed campaign hats, but the supply ran out when our turn came. We felt envious and cheated every time we saw those salty-looking Smokey Bear hats on the range. Early in the first morning at the rifle range, we began what was probably the most thorough and the most effective rifle marksmanship training given to any troops of any nation during World War II. We were divided into 2-man teams the first week for dry firing or snapping in. We concentrated on proper sight setting, trigger squeeze, calling of shots, use of the leather sling as a shooting aid, and other fundamentals. It soon became obvious why we all received thick pads to be sewn onto the elbows and right shoulders of our dungaree jackets. During this snapping in, each man and his buddy practiced together, one in the proper position, standing, kneeling, sitting, or prone. and squeezing the trigger, and the other pushing back the rifle bolt lever with the heel of his hand, padded by an empty cloth bandolier wrapped around the palm. This procedure cocked the rifle and simulated recoil. The DIs and rifle coaches checked every man continuously. Everything had to be just so. Our arms became sore from being contorted into various positions and having the leather sling straining our joints and biting into our muscles. Most of us had problems perfecting the sitting position, which I never saw used in combat. But the coach helped everyone the way he did me, simply by plopping his weight on my shoulders until I was able to assume the correct position. Those familiar with firearms quickly forgot what they knew and learned the Marine Corps way. Second only to accuracy was safety. Its principles were pounded into us mercilessly. Keep the piece pointed toward the target. Never point a rifle at anything you don't intend to shoot. Check your rifle each time you pick it up to be sure it isn't loaded. Many accidents have occurred with unloaded rifles. We went onto the firing line and received live ammunition the next week. At first, the sound of rifles firing was disconcerting, but not for long. Our snapping in had been so thorough, we went through our paces automatically. We fired at round black bullseye targets from 100, 300, and 500 yards. Other platoons worked the butts. Butts refers to the impact area on a rifle range. It consists of the targets mounted on a vertical track system above a sheltered dugout, usually made of concrete, in which other shooters operate, mark, and score the targets for those on the firing line. When the range officer ordered, "Ready on the right, ready on the left, all ready on the firing line, commence firing," I felt as though the rifle was part of me, and vice versa. My concentration was complete. Discipline was ever present, but the harassment that had been our daily diet gave way to deadly serious, businesslike instruction in marksmanship. Punishment for infractions of the rules came swiftly and severely, however. One man next to me turned around slightly to speak to a buddy after "cease firing" was given. The action caused his rifle muzzle to angle away from the targets. The sharp-eyed captain in charge of the range rushed up from behind and booted the man in the rear so hard that he fell flat on his face. The captain then jerked him up off the deck and bawled him out loudly and thoroughly. We got his message. Platoon 984 took its turn in the butts. As we sat safely in the dugouts and waited for each series of firing to be completed, I had somber thoughts about the crack and snap of bullets passing overhead. Qualification day dawned clearly and brightly. We were apprehensive, having been told that anyone who didn't shoot high enough to qualify as marksman wouldn't go overseas. When the final scores were totaled, I was disappointed. I fell short of expert rifleman by only 2 points. However, I proudly wore the Maltese cross-shaped sharpshooter's badge, and I didn't neglect to point out to my Yankee buddies that most of the high shooters in our platoon were Southern boys. Feeling like old salts, we returned to the recruit depot for the final phases of recruit training. The DIs didn't treat us as veterans, though. Harassment picked up quickly to its previous intensity. By the end of 8 grueling weeks, it had become apparent that Corporal Doherty and the other DIs had done their jobs well. We were hard physically, had developed endurance, and had learned our lessons. Perhaps more importantly, we were tough mentally. One of our assistant drill instructors even allowed himself to mumble that we might become Marines after all. Finally, late in the afternoon of 24 December 1943, we fell in without rifles and cartridge belts. Dressed in service greens, each man received 3 bronze Marine Corps globe and anchor emblems, which we put into our pockets. We marched to an amphitheater where we sat with several other platoons. This was our graduation from boot camp. A short, affable-looking major standing on the stage said, "Men, you have successfully completed your recruit training and are now United States Marines. Put on your Marine Corps emblems and wear them with pride. You have a great and proud tradition to uphold. You are members of the world's finest fighting outfit, so be worthy of it." We took out our emblems and put one on each lapel of our green wool coats and one on the left side of the overseas caps. The major told several dirty jokes. Everyone laughed and whistled. Then he said, "Good luck, men." That was the first time we had been addressed as men during our entire time in boot camp. Before dawn the next day, Platoon 984 assembled in front of the huts for the last time. We shouldered our sea bags, slung our rifles, and struggled down to a warehouse where a line of trucks was parked. Corporal Doherty told us that each man was to report to the designated truck as his name and destination was called out. The few men selected to train as specialists, radar technicians, aircraft mechanics, and so on, were to turn in their rifles, bayonets, and cartridge belts. As the men moved out of ranks, there were quiet remarks of, "So long, see you, take it easy." We knew that many friendships were ending right there. Doherty called out, "Eugene B. Sledge, 534-559, full individual equipment and M1 rifle, infantry, Camp Elliot." Most of us were designated for infantry, and we went to Camp Elliot or to Camp Pendleton. Camp Elliot was a small installation located on the northern outskirts of San Diego. It has been used rarely since World War II. 35 miles north of San Diego lies Camp Joseph H. Pendleton. Home today of the 1st Marine Division, it is the Marine Corps' major West Coast amphibious base. As we helped each other aboard the trucks, it never occurred to us why so many were being assigned to infantry. We were destined to take the places of the ever-mounting numbers of casualties in the rifle or line companies in the Pacific. We were fated to fight the war firsthand. We were cannon fodder. After all assignments had been made, the trucks rolled out, and I looked at Doherty watching us leave. I disliked him, but I respected him. He had made us Marines, and I wondered what he thought as we rolled by. Chapter 2. Preparation for Combat. Infantry Training. Most of the buildings at Camp Elliot were neat wooden barracks, painted cream, with dark roofs. The typical 2-story barracks was shaped like an H, with the squad bays in the upright parts of the letter. The many-windowed squad bays held about 25 double-decker metal bunks. The room was big, roomy, and well-lighted. The ensuing 2 months were the only period during my entire service in World War II that I lived in a barracks. The remaining time I slept under canvas or the open sky. No one yelled at us or screamed orders to hurry up. The NCOs seemed relaxed to the point of being lethargic. We had the free run of the camp, except for certain restricted areas. Taps and lights out were at 2200. We were like birds out of a cage after the confinement and harassment of boot camp. With several boys who bunked near me, I sampled the draft beer at the Slop Shoot, enlisted men's club, bought candy and ice cream at the PX, post-exchange, and explored the area. Our newly found freedom was heady stuff. We spent the first few days at Camp Elliot at lectures and demonstrations dealing with the various weapons in a Marine infantry regiment. We received an introduction to the 37mm anti-tank gun, 81mm mortar, 60mm mortar, 50 caliber machine gun, 30 caliber heavy and light machine guns, and the Browning automatic rifle, BAR. We also ran through combat tactics for the rifle squad. Most of our conversation around the barracks concerned the various weapons and whether or not it would be good duty to be on a 37mm gun crew, light machine gun, or 81mm mortar. There was always one man, frequently, in fact, usually, a New Englander, who knew it all and claimed to have the latest hot dope on everything. I talked to a guy over at the PX who had been through 81mm mortar school, and he said them damn mortars are so heavy he wished to hell he had gotten into 37mm guns so he could ride in a Jeep while it pulled the gun. I talked to a guy over at Camp Pendleton, and he said a mortar shell blew up over there just as it was fired and killed the instructor and all the crew. I'm getting into light machine guns. They say that's a good deal. Like hell. My uncle was in France in World War I, and he said the average life of a machine gunner was about 2 minutes. I'm going to be a rifleman, so I won't have to tote all that weight around. So it went. None of us had the slightest idea what he was talking about. One day we fell in and were told to separate into groups according to which weapon we wanted to train with. If our first choice was filled, we made a second selection. The mere fact that we had a choice amazed me. Apparently, the idea was that a man would be more effective on a weapon he had picked rather than one to which he had been assigned. I chose 60mm mortars. The first morning, those in 60mm mortars marched behind a warehouse where several light tanks were parked. Our mortar instructor, a sergeant, told us to sit down and listen to what he had to say. He was a clean-cut, handsome, blond man wearing neat khakis, faded to just that right shade that indicated a salty uniform. His bearing oozed calm self-confidence. There was no arrogance or bluster about him, yet he was obviously a man who knew himself and his job and would put up with no nonsense from anybody. He had an intangible air of subdued, quiet detachment, a quality possessed by so many of the combat veterans of the Pacific campaigns whom I met at that time. Sometimes his mind seemed a million miles away, as though lost in some sort of melancholy reverie. It was a genuine attribute, unrehearsed and spontaneous. In short, it couldn't be imitated consciously. I noted this carefully in my early days in the Marine Corps, but never understood it until I observed the same thing in my buddies after Peleliu. One man raised his hand, and the sergeant said, "Okay, what's your question?" The man began with, "Sir," the sergeant laughed and said, "Address me as sergeant, not sir." "Yes, sir." "Look, you guys are U.S. Marines now. You are not in boot camp anymore. Just relax. Work hard and do your job right, and you won't have any trouble. You'll have a better chance of getting through the war." He won our respect and admiration instantly. My job is to train you people to be 60mm mortarmen. The 60mm mortar is an effective and important infantry weapon. You can break up enemy attacks on your company's front with this weapon, and you can soften enemy defenses with it. You will be firing over the heads of your own buddies at the enemy a short distance away, so you've got to know exactly what you're doing. Otherwise, there'll be short rounds, and you'll kill and wound your own men. I was a 60mm mortarman on Guadalcanal and saw how effective this weapon was against the Japs there. Any questions?
This ends Disc 1.